The sky fractured with lightning as James Harrington's private jet shuddered violently, metal screaming against the forces of nature. One moment he'd been reviewing acquisition reports at 30,000 feet, scotch in hand. The next, chaos. Warning lights flashed crimson across the cockpit as the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, tension straining every word. "Mr. Harrington, we've lost the right engine. Attempting emergency protocols." James braced himself against the mahogany paneling of his $65 million Gulfstream, the irony not lost on him that his wealth, the very thing that had insulated him from life's hardships for decades, now meant nothing against the indifferent fury of the storm. The plane dropped suddenly, throwing him against his seatbelt with bruising force. "Brace for impact," the pilot shouted, his professional calm finally shattering. James closed his eyes, mind racing through images of his life. Not his corporate triumphs or his Manhattan penthouse or his fleet of cars. Instead, he saw his daughter's face when she was 6, before the divorce, before he'd missed too many birthdays in pursuit of the next billion. He saw his father's weathered hands, the ones he'd been ashamed of when he'd climbed the corporate ladder. The hands of a man who worked the earth. The impact came with a deafening roar. Metal tore, glass shattered, and the world spun violently before everything went black. Pain pulsed through his consciousness first. Then the smell of wet earth and burning fuel. James opened his eyes to rain falling on his face through what had once been the roof of his aircraft. He tried to move but found himself pinned, a shooting agony lancing through his leg. The pilot and co-pilot hung limp in their harnesses. The realization struck him with horrifying clarity. No one was coming. His security team would be tracking the plane, but in this remote countryside, with communications down in the storm, he could be dead before they reached him. "Hello?" A voice, young, female, penetrated the wreckage. "Is anyone alive in there?" Through the haze of pain, James saw her, a slender silhouette against the darkening sky, rain soaking her simple clothes as she carefully navigated the twisted metal. No more than 20, with hands that showed years of hard work and eyes that reflected both fear and determination. "Help," he managed, the word catching in his throat. The girl, Eliza Mason, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, didn't hesitate. Despite the danger of leaking fuel and unstable wreckage, she climbed inside, assessing him with a surprisingly clinical gaze. "Your leg is trapped, not crushed," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I need to free you before the fuel catches fire." Using strength born from years of farm labor, she leveraged debris away from his leg, ignoring the cuts opening across her own hands. James bit back a scream as circulation returned to his limb in a rush of agony. "Can you move?" she asked, already checking the pilots, her face falling as she confirmed what James already knew. "I think so," he grunted, though in truth he wasn't certain. Lightning illuminated her face as she made a decision. "We need to get you out. Now." With her shoulder under his, they stumbled from the wreckage just as flames began to lick at the spilled fuel. The explosion knocked them forward, heat searing their backs as they fell into the mud. James watched $50 million of engineering erupt into a fireball, carrying with it the bodies of 2 men who had families waiting for them somewhere. "Come on," Eliza urged, pulling him to his feet despite his greater weight. "My farm is just over that rise. We need to get you warm and stop that bleeding." Through sheets of rain, with mud sucking at their feet, she half-carried a man worth billions of dollars, a man whose annual income was more than her entire village would see in generations. Yet in this moment, the vast chasm between their worlds meant nothing. He was simply a human being in need, and she was his lifeline. The farmhouse appeared through the gloom, small, weathered, with a single light burning in the window. Inside, warmth enveloped them as an older woman, Eliza's mother, gasped at the sight of her daughter, supporting a bloodied stranger. "Ma, he survived the crash. The others." Eliza's voice finally broke, the reality of what she'd witnessed catching up to her. "Get him by the fire," her mother commanded, already gathering towels and their meager first aid supplies. James found himself lowered onto a worn couch that had clearly been mended many times over. The humble room swam in his vision. Simple furnishings, patches of damp on the ceiling where the roof leaked, faded photographs of family on walls that needed paint. Yet there was a warmth here that had nothing to do with the crackling fire, a sense of home that his sterile penthouse had never possessed. Eliza cleaned his wounds with gentle efficiency, her mother brewing tea with herbs from their garden to help with the pain. James watched through a haze as they worked, these women who had so little, yet gave so freely. "Why?" he finally asked as Eliza stitched a gash on his arm with supplies clearly precious to them. She looked puzzled. "Why what? Why help me? You don't know who I am. I could be anyone." Her hands paused, and she met his gaze directly. "You're someone who needed help. That's all that matters." The simplicity of her answer struck him with more force than the crash. In his world, every action came with calculation, with expectation of return. Nothing was given freely, not time, not resources, certainly not kindness. Yet here, in this leaking farmhouse on the edge of a struggling village, this young woman had risked her life for a stranger, without a second thought. As the storm raged outside, James felt something shift within him. The contrast between her world and his own became painfully clear. He had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, yet had forgotten the value of human connection. These people, with their calloused hands and limited means, possessed a richness he'd lost sight of decades ago. "Our phone lines are down in the storm," Eliza's mother explained, misreading his silence as concern. "But my son has gone to the village to call for help. It might take time. The roads flood in weather like this." James nodded, suddenly in no hurry for his security team to arrive with their clinical efficiency and corporate helicopters. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was experiencing something authentic, compassion without agenda. Through the night, as fever took hold from his injuries, Eliza kept vigil. She bathed his forehead with cool cloths, changed his bandages, and spoke softly about her life when he was lucid enough to listen. He learned about the village's struggles, the failing crops due to changing weather patterns, the lack of medical facilities, the young people leaving because there was no future here. He learned how Eliza had stayed to care for her aging parents, sacrificing her dream of becoming a doctor. In his delirium, James found himself confessing his own truths, how empty his achievements felt, how his relationships had withered under the relentless pursuit of more, how the higher he climbed, the less he recognized the man in the mirror. By dawn, as the storm finally broke and sunlight filtered through the windows, something had fundamentally changed in James Harrington. The near-death experience had cracked open a calcified part of his soul, but it was Eliza's uncommon kindness that had reached inside and awakened something he thought long dead. When his security team finally arrived, storming the small farmhouse with the efficiency of a military operation, James saw the family's humble home through new eyes, and he saw the barely concealed disdain on his employees' faces. The contrast was jarring, shameful. "Mr. Harrington, the helicopter is standing by," his head of security announced, barely acknowledging Eliza or her mother. "Thank you, Phillips," James said, rising shakily to his feet. He turned to Eliza, suddenly awkward in his gratitude. "I owe you my life." She shook her head. "You owe me nothing. Anyone would have done the same." But they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked themselves for a stranger. Not everyone would have opened their home and shared their limited resources. Not everyone had retained that core of human compassion that Eliza embodied. As James was helped toward the door, he paused, looking back at the young woman who had saved him, not just his life, but perhaps his humanity as well. "This isn't goodbye," he promised, the words feeling more sincere than any business deal he'd ever closed. "I'll be back." He didn't yet know how he would repay this debt that could never truly be repaid. He didn't yet understand how this single night would reshape his priorities and legacy. But as the helicopter lifted off, revealing the patchwork of struggling farms and the small, weathered village below, James Harrington, billionaire, tycoon, survivor, made a silent vow that would change everything. Not just for him, but for Eliza and every soul in the village that had saved him in more ways than one. 3 weeks after the crash, Eliza Mason stood in her family's modest kitchen, washing dishes as rain pattered against the window. Her hands, still bearing faint scars from the night she'd pulled James Harrington from the wreckage, moved mechanically through the familiar chore while her mind wandered. The stranger she'd saved had vanished in his helicopter, whisked back to a world she could scarcely imagine. His parting promise, "This isn't goodbye," had echoed in her dreams, but reality had settled back in like the persistent damp that plagued their aging farmhouse. The village had buzzed with the story for days. A billionaire's plane crash. Eliza Mason, pulling him from the flames. But excitement had given way to the grinding routine of survival. Crops still needed tending, despite the increasingly unpredictable weather. The clinic in the next town over had closed, forcing Mrs. Abernathy to travel 4 hours for her heart medication. The school roof still leaked, the children huddling under plastic tarps during lessons when it rained. Life continued, unchanged by their brush, with extraordinary circumstances. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Her mother, who had been mending clothes by the fire, looked up with a puzzled expression. They rarely received visitors, especially on a Tuesday afternoon. "I'll get it," Eliza said, drying her hands on her worn apron. She opened the door to find a tall man in an impeccable suit, seemingly unbothered by the mud that had surely clung to his polished shoes on the walk from the road. Behind him, a sleek black car waited, looking utterly alien against the backdrop of their weathered farm. "Miss Mason?" the man asked, his voice professionally warm. "My name is Phillips. We met briefly during Mr. Harrington's evacuation." Eliza recognized him now, the head of security who had barely acknowledged her existence when they'd taken James away. "Mr. Harrington has requested your presence in the city," Phillips continued, handing her a cream-colored envelope with her name written in elegant script. "All the details are inside. The car is at your disposal." Before she could formulate a response, he nodded politely and returned to the waiting vehicle. Eliza stood frozen in the doorway, the heavy paper envelope feeling like a foreign object in her calloused hands. "Who was that?" her mother called. Eliza closed the door slowly. "It's from him, the man from the plane." Inside the envelope, she found a handwritten letter on stationery that probably cost more than their monthly groceries, inviting her, imploring her, really, to visit him in the city. A bank card was enclosed for any expenses, along with a phone number should she need anything at all. "I can't just leave," she protested to her mother, who had read the letter over her shoulder. "The harvest is coming, and Pa needs help with his medications and—" "Go," her mother said simply, her weathered hands gently taking the letter. "Your father and I managed before you were born, and we'll manage for a few days without you. Besides," she added with a soft smile, "aren't you even a little curious?" 2 days later, Eliza found herself stepping out of a chauffeur-driven car in front of a glass skyscraper that seemed to touch the clouds. Her simple dress, the best she owned, felt woefully inadequate among the stream of impeccably dressed professionals entering and exiting the building. The doorman, however, greeted her by name, as if he'd been waiting specifically for her arrival. "Miss Mason, welcome. Mr. Harrington is expecting you." The elevator whisked her upward at a speed that left her stomach somewhere on the ground floor. When the doors opened, she stepped directly into a space that defied her understanding of what an office could be. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city sprawled below, like a living map. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, all clean lines and materials she couldn't name. And there, standing by the windows, was James Harrington. The man she'd dragged from burning wreckage now stood tall and composed, the only evidence of his ordeal a faint scar along his jawline and a barely perceptible limp as he crossed the room to greet her. "Eliza," he said, taking her hands in his with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming." Up close, she could see the changes in him that went beyond his physical recovery. There was something different in his eyes, a clarity, a presence that hadn't been there during his feverish night in their home. "Your office is large," she managed, immediately feeling foolish for the observation. James laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. Yes, I suppose it is. Unnecessarily so, actually. He gestured toward a sitting area. Please sit. We have much to discuss. Over the next hour, Eliza found herself sharing more about her village than she ever had before. James asked questions no outsider had ever bothered with, not just about infrastructure needs, but about people. Who were the village elders? What dreams did the children harbor? What traditions mattered most to the community? He listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard, taking notes in a leather-bound journal with a pen that probably cost more than her family's monthly income. Why are you doing this? She finally asked, setting down the untouched tea that had been served in delicate porcelain cups. Is it because you feel you owe me something? Because you don't. James set his pen down and looked at her directly. The night of the crash, I was flying back from closing a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was congratulating myself on my cleverness, on outmaneuvering my competitors. He stood, moving to the window. And then the sky reminded me how small I really am. He turned back to her, vulnerability naked on his face. But it wasn't nearly dying that changed me, Eliza. It was you. I didn't do anything special, she protested. That's precisely it, he said, returning to sit across from her. You risked your life for a stranger. You shared your limited resources without hesitation. The compassion you showed me, that your family showed me, was offered without calculation, without expectation of return. His voice grew softer. Do you know how rare that is in my world? Eliza felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. It's just how we were raised. And that's worth more than everything in this building, James said firmly. You showed me what I've been missing, what I've forgotten in my pursuit of wealth. Pure-hearted compassion, human connection without agenda. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. I've spent 3 weeks thinking about what truly matters, about legacy, about purpose, and I've come to a decision. From his desk, he retrieved a folder and handed it to her. Inside were architectural plans, legal documents, and photographs that took her breath away. What is this? She asked, though the answer was becoming clear as she flipped through the pages. A foundation, James explained, his excitement barely contained. The Mason Foundation, named for the family that saved more than just my life. Its purpose is to revitalize your village while preserving its character and values. The plans detailed a new medical clinic, school renovations, sustainable farming initiatives, and infrastructure improvements. But unlike typical development projects, these plans had clearly been designed with intimate knowledge of the village's unique needs and character. How did you know about the school roof? About Mrs. Abernathy's heart condition? Eliza asked, astonished by the details captured in the proposals. James smiled. I sent a team, anthropologists, rural development specialists, medical professionals, to quietly assess needs while respecting your community's dignity. They lived in the village for 2 weeks, learning from the inside rather than imposing solutions from outside. Eliza's fingers traced the outline of the proposed clinic, modest in size, but equipped with everything their community had desperately needed for years. This must cost millions. It will, James acknowledged without hesitation. And it's the best investment I've ever made. But why? She asked again, needing to understand. Is this guilt? Gratitude? Tax benefits? The cynicism in her voice surprised even her. James didn't flinch from the question. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing the jagged scar where she had stitched his arm by firelight. The night you saved me, you said something I can't forget. When I asked why you helped me, you said, "You're someone who needed help." That's all that matters. His eyes held hers steadily. For 30 years, I've asked, what's the return? Before every decision. I've calculated value in dollars and cents, in power gained or advantages secured. But you acted purely from compassion, from the simple recognition of human need. He gently closed the folder in her hands. This isn't about guilt or tax benefits, Eliza. It's about learning from you, about recognizing that true wealth isn't what I've been accumulating all these years. It's what you already have in abundance, the capacity to see humanity in others and respond with pure-hearted compassion. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, not from gratitude for the material help being offered, but from the profound recognition that this powerful man had truly seen her, had valued something in her that the world rarely acknowledged as valuable. "The foundation has one condition," James continued softly. "You must lead it. Your compassion, your understanding of your community, these are assets no amount of my money can buy." Eliza gasped. "But I don't know anything about running a foundation. I never even finished school." "You know what matters most, how to see people as people, not problems to solve or resources to exploit. The rest is just details. I have teams who can handle the logistics, the legal requirements. But the heart of this endeavor? That has to be you." As the sun began to set, casting the office in golden light, Eliza looked down at her hands, the hands that had pulled James from wreckage, that had tended crops and cared for her parents, that had never known luxury, but had always known purpose. "If I do this," she said slowly, finding courage in unfamiliar territory, "the village remains ours. No corporate takeover disguised as charity. The people decide their future." James nodded without hesitation. "That's precisely the point. This isn't charity, it's recognition of worth already present. Your community's values, its connections, its way of caring for one another, these are the very things the rest of the world desperately needs to remember." In that moment, sitting across from a billionaire in a skyscraper far from her mud-spattered farm, Eliza felt a strange equilibrium establish itself. He had wealth and power beyond imagination. She had roots and community and compassion. And somehow, in the aftermath of disaster, they had each recognized in the other something essential they themselves were missing. "Then I accept," she said, extending her hand not as a supplicant, but as an equal. When James took it, the handshake sealed more than a business arrangement. It marked the beginning of a partnership founded on the purest form of human connection, the recognition of worth in another, and the choice to act with compassion without calculation. As they stood there, the city lights beginning to twinkle below them like earthbound stars, neither could have predicted how this moment would ripple outward, transforming not just a village, but eventually challenging the very foundations of how wealth and compassion could coexist in the modern world. But that transformation had already begun, sparked by a storm, a crash, and a farmer's daughter who ran toward danger rather than away from it, all because someone needed help, and that was all that mattered. 1 year later, the village of Millfield barely resembled the struggling community it had once been. Where potholes had made roads nearly impassable, smooth pavement now connected neat homes with freshly painted shutters. The old schoolhouse stood tall with a new roof and solar panels glinting in the sunshine. Most remarkably, a state-of-the-art medical clinic now served not just Millfield but 3 neighboring communities, its modest exterior belying the cutting-edge equipment inside. Yet, unlike so many revitalization projects that erased a community's character in the name of progress, Millfield remained distinctly itself. The century-old oak in the town square still hosted the annual Harvest Festival. Mrs. Patterson still taught 3rd grade, though now in a classroom where rain didn't interrupt lessons. The essence of the place, the connections between neighbors, the rhythm of rural life, hadn't been lost but rather strengthened, freed from the desperate struggle for basic necessities. On this particular golden autumn afternoon, James Harrington stood on the edge of what had once been the Mason family's struggling farm. Now it served as the demonstration center for sustainable agricultural practices, with students from 3 counties visiting regularly to learn techniques that blended traditional wisdom with climate-resilient innovation. The second round of soil samples came back even better than expected, Eliza said, approaching with tablet in hand, her confidence in her new role evident in her stride. Gone was the hesitant farm girl who had stepped nervously into his skyscraper office a year ago. In her place stood a woman who had discovered her purpose, a natural leader whose compassion informed every decision, whose intuitive understanding of her community guided the foundation's work with a wisdom no MBA could provide. James smiled, taking in the sight of farmers examining new irrigation systems with genuine interest rather than suspicion. They're actually listening now. They're participating, Eliza corrected gently. That's the difference. They're not being told what to do. They're helping design solutions that work for their land, their families. James nodded, understanding the distinction. It had been their first major disagreement, his instinct to sweep in with prepackaged solutions versus her insistence that true transformation required community ownership. She had been right, of course. The farmers who had initially resisted city ideas now proudly showcased their innovations, their dignity intact, their knowledge respected. Your parents would be proud, James said softly, glancing toward the Mason family home, now beautifully restored but still unmistakably theirs. The medical treatments that had seemed impossibly out of reach a year ago had given Eliza's father back his mobility, his pain managed by specialists who visited weekly. Eliza's eyes misted briefly. They are. Though Pa still thinks you're crazy for wasting money on people who can never pay you back. That's where he's wrong, James replied, his voice unexpectedly thick with emotion. I've been paid back 1,000 times over. He meant it. In the year since the crash that had nearly claimed his life, James Harrington had transformed almost as dramatically as the village itself. The driven, isolated billionaire who measured worth in assets and acquisitions had discovered something his wealth had never been able to buy: purpose. Real, soul-deep purpose that woke him eager each morning and settled him into satisfied sleep each night. The Mason Foundation had become his primary focus, with trusted deputies now running his business empire while he devoted himself to what he'd come to think of as his true legacy. What had begun as a single village project had evolved into a model being studied by community developers and social impact investors globally. The board approved the expansion, James said, breaking their companionable silence as they walked between rows of experimental drought-resistant crops. 3 more villages next year, using everything we've learned here. Eliza stopped, turning to face him fully. That's wonderful, but I can't possibly oversee 3 more communities with the same attention Millfield needed. James grinned. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to. Remember Thomas Cooper? The banker who lost his job and nearly lost his home. Eliza nodded. Thomas had been one of their first successes, a middle-aged man devastated by the bank closure, too proud to accept help until the foundation offered him a role managing microloans for local businesses. He'll oversee the financial frameworks for the new villages. And Sarah Jenkins from the school board will coordinate the educational initiatives. We're not just replicating buildings, Eliza, we're replicating leadership. Finding the natural connectors, the compassionate hearts in each community, and giving them the resources to transform their own worlds. Understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. You're not building dependencies. I'm recognizing what you showed me, James corrected. That true transformation comes from within communities, not from outside saviors. My money is just a tool. It's the people like you who create lasting change. They reached the crest of a gentle hill, where a simple granite bench had been installed facing west towards spectacular sunset views. It had become their unofficial meeting spot over the past year, a place for candid conversations away from the Foundation's busy offices. As they sat, a comfortable silence settled between them, 2 people from vastly different worlds who had found in each other unexpected friendship and mutual respect. The Harvard Business Review wants to interview you, Eliza said finally, amusement dancing in her eyes. Something about disrupting the philanthropy model. James groaned. More business jargon. That's exactly what we're trying to move beyond. Yes, but your former peers are paying attention. Other billionaires are asking questions about the Harrington-Mason method. She nudged his shoulder playfully. Isn't that what you wanted? To change how wealth engages with community. He considered this, watching golden light spill across the patchwork of healthy fields below them. What I wanted was to repay an unpayable debt to the woman who pulled me from a burning plane. And what do you want now? Eliza asked quietly. The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. James took a moment before answering, his gaze still on the horizon. I want this feeling to spread, he said finally. Not just to other wealthy individuals, though that would be start, but to everyone. This understanding that transformation, real, meaningful transformation, happens when gratitude becomes purpose. He turned to face her, the setting sun illuminating the sincerity in his expression. Before the crash, I had achieved everything society told me represented success. Wealth, power, recognition. But I was hollow inside, constantly chasing the next acquisition, the next triumph, to fill a void I couldn't name. And now? Eliza prompted gently. Now I understand what you knew instinctively that night in the storm. That human connection, seeing another person's need and responding with compassion, is what gives life meaning. Not accumulation, not status. Just the simple, profound act of helping, because help is needed. From the valley below, laughter drifted up, children playing in the new community garden, their parents gathering for the weekly community dinner that had become a cherished tradition. The sound represented everything they had worked for, not just improved infrastructure, but strengthened human bonds. The foundation's getting attention from places I never expected, James continued. Policymakers, economists, even military strategists, all studying how empowering compassionate local leadership creates resilience that top-down approaches never achieve. Eliza smiled. All because your plane fell from the sky in exactly the right place. In exactly the right place, James agreed, the memory of that terrifying night now transformed by all that had followed. Though I wouldn't recommend it as a strategy for others. They laughed together, the easy comfort of their friendship evident in the sound. From unlikely beginnings, a billionaire broken and bleeding in a farmhouse kitchen had grown a partnership that defied conventional categories. Not quite business, not quite charity, but something new, a model of mutual transformation where both wealth and compassion found their highest expression. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange and pink, a small delegation approached the hill, community members coming to escort them to the harvest dinner. James recognized faces that had once viewed him with suspicion, now alight with welcome. These people had become more than beneficiaries of his philanthropy. They had become his teachers, his friends, his community. Rising from the bench, James offered Eliza his hand, a gesture that had become symbolic of their unique relationship. The billionaire and the farmer's daughter, each having saved the other in ways neither could have imagined that stormy night a year ago. Ready for the next chapter? He asked, as they prepared to join the waiting group. Eliza's smile held the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her purpose and embraced it fully. Always. As they walked down the hill together toward the waiting community, neither spoke of how profoundly they had changed each other's lives. There was no need. The evidence surrounded them, in the thriving village, in the expanding foundation, in the ripples of transformation spreading outward like light from the setting sun. What had begun as a desperate act of rescue had evolved into something far more powerful, a testament to how compassion, when met with resources and respect, could transform not just a village, but the very meaning of wealth itself. The plane crash that had nearly ended James Harrington's life had instead given him something priceless, a legacy not of buildings or bank accounts, but of lives transformed through the alchemy that occurs when gratitude becomes purpose. And in the simple farmer's daughter who had pulled him from wreckage, he had found not just a savior but a guide to a kind of richness he had never known existed, the wealth of human connection, of meaningful work, of belonging to something larger than himself. As they joined the community gathering, where tables groaned with the bounty of newly fertile fields and faces shone with the dignity of those who had helped create their own renaissance, James realized that his near-death experience had indeed changed everything. Not by showing him how fleeting life could be, but by introducing him to Eliza Mason, a young woman whose instinctive compassion had awakened his own, transforming not just a village, but the very heart of a man who had everything and nothing all at once. In the end, the crash had been just the beginning. The real story, the one that would echo through communities and boardrooms alike for years to come, was what happened after. When a life saved became a life transformed, when gratitude became purpose, and when a simple act of human kindness sparked a revolution of compassion that neither wealth nor poverty alone could have achieved. This was their legacy. Not a transaction of rescue and repayment, but a continuous circle of transformation that would long outlive them both. And as night fell over the village that had saved him in more ways than one, James Harrington finally understood the truth that Eliza had known all along, that the measure of a life well lived is not what you accumulate, but what you give away, not in money, but in seeing the humanity in others and responding with an open heart.